Hello, dear friends. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to Spiritism 101. We have been following the book by Louis Hu. We've been talking about the three revelations, the Hydesville phenomena, the turning tables, Allan Kardec, God, Spiritist hierarchies, perispirit, spiritual influences, dreams, mediumship and mediums, psychography, Chico Xavier, reincarnation, the earth, prayer, and today we're going to talk about the crowning subject, and that is Jesus. Today, yes, we're going to talk about Jesus. And you're going to ask, how can you talk about Jesus, Sunshine? How can we all talk about Jesus? Isn't he too big? Isn't the experience too humongous to even put into words? Well, we will do our best. We will give you some ideas, some pointers, some of his teachings, and of course we will only scrape on the surface. But hopefully it will give you some incentive, some ideas, some desire to go deeper. And we all know we're feeling Jesus in our hearts. He is in our hearts and he's our guide and model. Now let us look at the Spirit's book and let us find out, why is Jesus our guide and model? Well, if we go to the Spirit's book, part 3, chapter 1, we find question 624. And here Allan Kardec asks the good spirits, what are the characteristics, 625, I apologize. What is the perfect standard that God has offered to humankind as a guide and model? Guess what the answer is? Look at Jesus. Jesus is the highest standard of moral perfection to which humankind on earth may aspire. God offers him as the most perfect model, and the doctrine he taught is the purest expression of God's law, because he was animated by the divine Spirit and was the purest being that has ever walked the earth. And now we know why we see Jesus as our guide and model. He was the purest incarnation in a human body on earth ever. And he has shown us exactly the path to follow to become a better human being, for us to morally develop. It's like the GPS. Jesus is our GPS. All we have to do is understand his teachings and practice and follow the guidelines, and we will succeed through effort and repetition. Now let us go to the Gospel, which is the 101, Spiritism 101, the part on the Gospel, page 8, if you like to follow along. And here we're going to back up for a moment. We're going to see how the stage was set on the earth by the highest level spirits to provide the right environment for Jesus to be born in, the perfect time, the perfect situation, the perfect country. So let us look what we're learning about that. Christ sent several wise spirits to the west and to the east. Earth underwent a preparation period of 600 years, prior to the coming of Christ, in order to attain its spiritual maturity and to prepare for the arrival of the gospel. Now we know that the teachings, that Jesus' teachings, are all in the gospel. So it took over 600 years to prepare the earth for Jesus' arrival. Isn't that unbelievable? So let's see how that would look like. Who did he send to the west? Christ primarily populates Greece with several wise philosophical and artistic spirits in the so-called Age of Pericles, which was 480 BC to 404 BC, before Christ. Socrates was a prominent figure amongst the others, and at certain times in his life he became close to exemplifying Christ himself. The teachings of Socrates, written by Plato, prepared the way of the gospel in the West. So it was the teachings of Socrates that prepared Jesus' path in the West. In them we can see the spiritual principles of the immortality of the soul, purification and self-knowledge in phrases such as, the most important human quest is that of moral perfection. So we're seeing that already Socrates taught us aspects of what Jesus would teach later again. And one is the immortality of the soul, the purification, and the importance of self-knowledge. And one of the saying, quote unquote, was the most important human quest is that of moral perfection. And that is exactly the path we're still on today. A life, here's another quote by Socrates, quote, a life without challenges is not worth living, end of quote. And here is another one, another quote by Socrates, there is only one good knowledge and only one evil ignorance. So education is of utmost importance, according to Socrates. And here's another one, quote, I am neither Athenian nor Greek, but a citizen of the world. See, again, we're getting the guidance of not getting too caught up in our language, in the country we were born and raised in, or maybe even the country we were living by choice. No, we're citizens of this world. Wise is he who knows the limits of his own ignorance, is another quote by Socrates. It points back to know thyself, right? And the other one is know thyself, be aware of your ignorance, and you will be wise. All very familiar to us from the teachings of Jesus later on. But this was before Jesus was born. This was all just fertilizing the ground on earth to be ready for the arrival of Jesus. And this was Socrates. Now let's look who else fertilized the ground. There was Alexander the Great. Some of you might have heard of him. He was around between 356 BC before Christ and 323 before Christ. He was one of Aristotle's disciples, and he dispersed Greek philosophy with its seed of Christian thought to the entire known world in his conquest. So he had the seeds of Christianity, and he populated those seeds in the ground through his conquests. And he was one of Aristotle's disciples. And what he dispersed also was his Greek philosophy. So this was Alexander the Great, another person incarnated to prepare the path for Jesus. And then there was Buddha. We all know Buddha. Buddha was on this earth between 623 BC and 543 BC. Now we're moving more towards the east, right? We started in the west with Socrates and Alexander the Great and Aristotle, and now we're moving more towards the east with Buddha. He was born in Nepal. Sent by Christ, Siddhartha Gautama, which is Buddha, teaches the right path to enlightenment to reach the so-called nirvana, the permanent union of the soul with God. So nirvana is defined as the perfect union between God and our souls. And that's what Buddha was teaching. His quotes are similar to the ones in the gospel. One of his quotes are, practice kindness, do not create suffering, and guide your own mind. Sound familiar, right? Another quote by Buddha, a person is only noble when they can feel compassion for all creatures. We know Buddha was very strongly, his teachings were very strongly connected to compassion. Here is another quote by Buddha. We are consequences of our thoughts. Wow, here we go. See, thoughts as the utmost important thing of us, how for us to create our world, our lives. Buddha was already teaching the people of his times to this day that we are the consequences of our thoughts. Peace comes from within. Do not seek it around yourself is another teaching by Buddha. And lastly, the origin of suffering is in the desires and illusions of passion. Now we understand that Buddha was certainly one of the important incarnations on this planet to prepare the arrival of Jesus. Then, further in the east, we have Lao Tzu. He was around in the 6th century before Christ in China. He was an enlightened spirit that taught the Tao, or the path, in the book Tao Te Ching, the book of the path and virtue. His quotes are similar to those in the Gospel again. The more selfish you are, the more you suffer. So this is a quote by the Tao. Sincere, another quote, sincere words are not pleasant, and the pleasant ones are not sincere. Yes, and here's another one. If you want to receive, you must first give. Therein the beginning of intelligence. Wow, profound. Can we imagine that? That's more than, it's about almost 3,000 years ago that this wise man, Lao Tzu, brought us those teachings. Here is another one by him. Whomever is good does not argue. Very wise. The prudent person prefers to be the last and is put first. Then we had Confucius. Confucius was alive between 551 BC and 479 BC, also before Christ. So Confucius prepared the way to the gospel in the East, as Socrates did in the West. So here we have Socrates in the West and Confucius in the East, preparing the path for Jesus. He resurrected the teachings of Lao Tzu and preached the human search for moral values. Here we see again the importance of the development of our moral values. His 5 principles are altruism, courtesy, moral knowledge, integrity, fidelity, and justice. Some of his quotes are, the superior person acts before they speak, and afterwards they speak according to their actions. Another one by Confucius was, study the past if you would divine the future. So it's kind of a version of the law of cause and effect. Here's another one. Humility is the solid foundation of all virtues. Here's another one. And we know how important humility is, right? Didn't Jesus teach us that over and over again? That pride and selfishness is at the root cause of all human evil, and that the antidote is humility. And here we have Confucius, 500 years before Christ was born, already teaching us that humility is the answer. Here's another one. When you see a good person, try to emulate them. When you see a bad person, examine yourself. Now that is something we ought to take to heart. If we see something that we criticize in others, to reflect it back to us, right? That would help us further to once again become more morally developed. And here's the last quote by Confucius. To not correct our own flaws is the same as committing new mistakes. Yes, we agree. The Greek-Roman culture, only 2 centuries before Christ, the Romans conquered Greece and absorbed the Greek culture. So 2 centuries, 200 years before Christ, the Romans conquered the Greek culture. Alexander the Great reincarnated once again, this time as Julius Caesar. That's an interesting fact. And he took the Greek-Roman culture and the Latin tongue, the Latin language, to the known world, and thus continuing to facilitate the future dissemination of the gospel. So we heard earlier that Alexander the Great was already, who was a student of Aristotle, was a disciple of Aristotle, laid the foundation for, teachings of the gospel, and later on he came back during the Roman Empire as Julius Caesar and continued on with his teachings. So now let us go to, let's see what book we're doing. Yeah, going next, page 10 in the same book. And we're going to read now a little bit more about Jesus Christ. The conditions are provided so that Earth can now start the definitive era of its spiritual maturity, and humanity is prepared to receive Christ, as we've just saw it. Jesus and his divine exemplification written in the gospel would deliver the code of fraternity and love to all hearts. Jesus is the spirit responsible for the creation of our planet. When he incarnated on earth, he taught us the supreme law of unconditional love. So here we're learning that that was the core of Jesus' teachings, namely unconditional love. And he was ready to incarnate at the time he did because of the very gradual yet meticulous preparation on earth through many different wise men who helped fertilize the ground. So when we look now at the year 0, when he was actually born, we look at something special. He was born in a manger. The manger marked the starting point of Christ's lesson. This is how Christ announced that humility represents the key to all virtues. Every little step of Jesus' life was a lesson, to the very last, from the very first moment to the very last moment. So the manger already taught us humility. The places. Jesus chose places of greater poverty and humbleness to live the intensity of his sublime teachings, showing humanity that truth did not require sumptuous locations and temples. Once again, we remember he was walking on the earth, very humble clothing. He did not own any properties. He did not go to any temples or churches. He just offered his healings and his teachings wherever he was, in a very humble way. He peacefully fought all official violence of Judaism, renewing the ancient law, such as the doctrine of clarification, tolerance, and forgiveness. Jesus did not come to rewrite the law, but he amended it. He gave it the loving twist, we want to say. And he brought peace. He never fought any establishment. Never once. The Sermon on the Mount provides lessons of conduct that dictated the principles that lead to goodness, such as to be humble, merciful, gentle, peaceful, just, and pure of heart. They can be considered a summary of the teachings on how to access the kingdom of heaven, which is not of this world. But as we are practicing those virtues, with charity being the highest virtue of them all, we will be getting closer to the kingdom of heaven. And we will be creating the kingdom of heaven a little bit more here on planet Earth and around us. So we're learning that the Sermon on the Mount is really the summary of all the teachings that Jesus brought. And we will be looking at the different Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount in a few minutes. Jesus disseminated the clearest visions of immortal life, teaching all earthly creatures that something superior to countries, flags, blood, and human laws existed. is the universal family. That is what he taught us, to not get too attached to our families of blood, our friends, our loved ones, but that we're living in a universal family, which means hopefully we find love for every single person, and not only people, but also animals that we encounter in our lives. Jesus' profound, energetic, and merciful word re-established all philosophies, shed light on the path of sciences, and would have already interlinked all religions on earth if humanity's impiety had not derailed his message. Yes, we weren't quite ready for his message at the time, and frankly, we're still struggling, aren't we? His lessons are applicable to all areas of human knowledge in the sense of social and political renewal through the moral transformation of humanity. The teachings propose a new era of economic justice and universal harmony and love. And the miracles that we know, we might call them miracles, but might find out that they're not miracles. Jesus' greatest miracle was actually the transformation his teachings of love and forgiveness generated in humanity. Isn't that the truth? So I read that again. That is really, really important. Jesus' greatest miracle was the transformation his teachings of love and forgiveness generated in humanity. This message is capable of changing, converting them into beings of goodness, and therefore transforming the world. And wouldn't we want to be one of those people who are practicing the virtues that Jesus brought to us, following his GPS he created for us, so that we can be on the forefront, hopefully, of helping to not only transform ourselves morally, but also helping this planet. It is a form of charity, isn't it? The Consoler. Jesus announced the coming of the Consoler of the Spirit of Truth, who would teach all spiritual truths and remember what he had said. So also Jesus announced that he wouldn't be able to say everything because the people of his times weren't ready to hear his messages that they wouldn't be able to understand. So he spoke of the Spirit of Truth, and he said he won't be one person, he won't be someone to touch, but it will be information that will explain what he wasn't able to explain. And we know that the Spirit of Truth is linked to Spiritism. It is Spiritism that he announced through the coming of the Spirit of Truth. Jesus taught Spiritist principles in his life. Mediumship on Mount Tabor, when he spoke with the spirits of Elijah and Moses moments prior to his crucifixion. After being crucified, Jesus, during 40 days, appeared to his disciples in a phenomenon called materialization. He could be seen and touched, thus demonstrating the immortality of the soul and the possibility of mediumistic communications. So what he incorporated was nothing that Spiritism, he brought actually what Spiritism then codified through the help of Allan Kardec and all the spirit literature that we have ever since Allan Kardec codified the doctrine of Spiritism. So, do we think that Jesus will ever return? What do you think? Let's see. Yes, Jesus should return spiritually speaking, meaning in our hearts. This will only happen when humanity understands and lives the gospel. Spiritism's role is to bring Christ to explain his teachings clearly and to help them to be better understood by all. And I think we can all agree that that is what Spiritism is doing. I know for myself, I always had a hard time understanding the gospel, and now it feels like such a clear roadmap. All we have to do is understand it and practice it every single day through effort and repetition. So let's see. Now we're going to let us go to Genesis for a moment. Genesis is one of the books that Alan Kardec codified on Spiritism. He did a total of 5. The Spirit's book, the Medium's book, the Gospel According to Spiritism, Genesis, and Heaven and Hell. So we find on page 315, chapter 15, Miracles in the Gospel. That is the title of the chapter if you wanted to follow along. And there is a subchapter that's called The Superiority of Jesus' Nature. Now we heard earlier the first thing that the spirits on high taught us is that the highest human being, the most perfect human being ever incarnated was Jesus. And that is why Jesus has become our guide and model. Because why wouldn't we want to study with Jesus, the most perfect teacher? So item 2 in this chapter we read, okay, here we are again, we're reconnected. I hope Kardec Radio is working. So without any preconceptions as to the nature of Christ, what is going on? Let me see, I lost it. Christ, here it is. Okay, Christ was a highly evolved spirit. We must recognize him as one of the highest order, and that due to his virtues, he is placed far above earthly humanity. Because of the immense results that he produced, his incarnation on this world could only have been one of those missions that are entrusted to the direct messengers of the divinity in order to fulfill its designs. So we need to know that Jesus did not have any incarnation on this planet because he had any karma, he had anything to expunge, any past wrongs to undo. His was a mission. He allowed himself, he wanted to come to this planet to help us. So his incarnation was a missionary incarnation. Even supposing that Christ was not God per se, but a messenger from God sent to transmit God's word, he would be more than a prophet, for he would be a divine Messiah. As a man, he had the bodily composition of corporeal beings, but as a pure spirit detached from matter, he would have lived the spirit life more than the corporeal life, the weaknesses of which he would not have had. Jesus did not have those human weaknesses any longer. The superiority of Jesus over other humans was not linked to the particularities of his body, but to those of his spirit, which dominated matter completely, and that of his perispirit, which was drawn from the most quintessential portion of earthly fluids. So absolutely fine matter was what Jesus was made of. And no, he was not Superman. He didn't have a muscular body and impressing us with that. It was his spirit that is our guide and model. That it was his spirit that was the perfect part of him. His soul must not have been connected to his body except by strictly indispensable ties. And since it was constantly detached, it must have given him a second side that was not only continuous, but exceptionally penetrating and far superior to anything seen among ordinary human beings. Such must have been also the case regarding all the phenomena that depend on the perispiritual or psychic fluids. The quality of these fluids endowed him with an immense magnetic power, seconded by his incessant desire to do the good. The incessant desire to do the good. And here again, he should be, or I hope he's our role model, to focus ourselves on doing the good. Did he act as a medium in the healings he performed? Could he be considered as a powerful healing medium? No, because a medium is an intermediary, an instrument that discarnate spirits use. Christ, however, had no need of assistance. He was the one who assisted others. Therefore, he acted by himself in virtue of his own personal power, just as incarnates can do in certain cases and according to the measure of their abilities. So what we're learning here in Genesis is that Jesus was not actually a medium. He actually acted out of his own power, out of his own purity that he had. So he didn't need to be an intermediary any longer. He acted by himself in virtue of his own personal power because he was such a virtuous spirit. Moreover, what other spirit would have dared to insufflate him with its own thoughts and charge him with transmitting them? If he did receive an outside influx, so if Jesus did receive an outside influx, it could only have been from God. According to the definition given by one spirit, Christ was God's medium. So, on the one hand, we're learning here that Jesus was not a medium, but there was one spirit who said that the only messenger he could have been coming from was God, and we know that. So it could have only been God's medium. But we're also learning that due to his purity, he actually was able to act on his own. So now we're moving back to, actually we're going first to the Gospel according to Spiritism by Allan Kardec, and we're going to chapter 1. And chapter 1 is, I have not come to destroy the law, which is what Jesus said. And we're going to the first part, which is the 3 revelations. We know that the first revelation was Moses, the 10 Commandments. And we know that the second revelation was Christ. And we know that the third revelation is Spiritism. So let us see what is written here under the second revelation, namely Christ. Jesus did not come to destroy the law, that is God's law, the law of love. He came to fulfill it, that is to develop it, to give it its true meaning, and to adapt it to the degree of humankind's advancement. That is why that in this law may be found the principle of duty to God and one's neighbor, which comprises the basis of his doctrine. So let us recap. The basis of his doctrine is the principle of duty to God above all things and to love our neighbors. So we have both a duty towards God and our neighbors. On the contrary, as for the laws of Moses per se, Jesus modified them profoundly, either in form or in substance. So he didn't come to destroy Moses' law, the 10 Commandments, but he came to fulfill and further development. He developed them. He rewrote them, as we're learning here. He modified them. He constantly combated the abuse of outward practices and erroneous interpretations, and he could not make them undergo a more radical reform than that of reducing them to these words. The 10 Commandments he was reducing to: love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself. So that was the bottom line of his teachings. Love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself. And in stating this is the whole of the law and the prophets. Jesus' role, however, was not simply that of a moralistic lawgiver, with no other authority than his own word. He came to fulfill the prophecies that had announced his coming. His authority derived from the exceptional nature of his spirit and his divine mission. He came to teach humans that true life is to be found not on the earth, but in the kingdom of heaven. To teach them the way that leads to the kingdom of heaven, the means of reconciling themselves to God, and to forewarn them regarding the progress of future things for the fulfillment of human destiny. So he taught us also he taught us about some future events. But above all, he taught us that the true life is not to be found on this earth, but it will be in the kingdom of heaven, which is really an internal process. And he also taught us how to get there. And we know that in a nutshell, it is by turning ourselves towards the good, to practice the good, to think the good, to speak the good, to mold the good, to act good. It's our whole entirety turning towards the good. So that is the gospel. And now we're going back to Louis Hu, Spiritism 101, on page 39. And there we find, let me see, what did Jesus actually teach? So we heard earlier, and we've heard it all along, that he came to bring love to this planet, and in a new form, in an unresembled form, and teaching us to do the good. And how did he do that? And we also mentioned the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' teachings are in the Gospels. We highlight the Sermon on the Mount. So the Gospels were written after Jesus was incarnated, after he left his body. However, the Sermon on the Mount was something that happened while he was on this planet, when he gathered the multitudes and he announced the Beatitudes, which are part of the Sermon on the Mount. And the other thing that's part of the Sermon on the Mount is the Lord's Prayer. So we highlight the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes are behavioral lessons that dictate the principles that lead to righteousness, such as humility, compassion, gentleness, peace, fairness, and purity of heart. So I say that again. The Beatitudes point us towards righteousness, humility, compassion, gentleness, peace, fairness, and purity of heart. The Beatitudes can be considered a summary of the teachings regarding the access to the kingdom of heaven. And here we have it. So here are the Beatitudes, and then we're going to talk about them a little bit. The first one is, blessed are the poor in spirit. Now we know that by poor in spirit, Jesus did not mean the unintelligent ones. He means essentially the humble. Blessed are the humble in spirit, because that is how we become more virtuous. The second beatitude is, blessed are those who mourn. And here he speaks about those who are in pain and are upset about that. And we're wondering, what are they mourning? First of all, he teaches us that that is actually a gift, because we are now allowed to undo and expunge some past wrongs. And we know, as a result of the law of cause and effect, that we are the heirs of our own actions. We need to harvest the fruits of our own seeds that we put into the ground. So when we're allowed to actually expunge one of those not so positive seeds we put into the ground, we start mourning. So what are we mourning? Well, when we look at the book by Emmett Fox, the Sermon on the Mount, he says we're actually mourning our own sins, because when we are suffering, that is the harvest that we are reaping of the seeds we put into our own soil. So now we're mourning that we weren't so intelligent in our choice. We weren't so morally developed to put the right seeds into the ground. So the third beatitude is, blessed are the meek. And here we can go to another part of the Spiritism 101 book. Just open it. Blessed are the meek and peace-loving. Here we're reading, Jesus turned gentleness, moderation, meekness, affability, and sweetness into a law. He condemned consequently anger and even any uncourteous expression towards another person. So that is, and this is just the tip of the iceberg of these beautiful Beatitudes. We know that there are many, many classes and many, many gatherings just on understanding and practicing the Beatitudes, which are the single most effective, from my perspective, the single most effective path to our own inner transformation. So that was blessed are the meek. And the next one is blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Now, hunger and thirst for righteousness, when we're hungry, we literally experience pain. Now, to hunger and thirst for righteousness teaches us that we must literally have a soul ache, a longing for righteousness. It must be such a deep-seated desire to find righteousness for our own inner transformation. And righteousness is more right thinking than anything else. And again, how can we best find right thinking other than practicing the Beatitudes as they were given to us by Jesus? Understanding, studying, and practicing them. So the fourth beatitude is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So Jesus creates hunger and thirst and links it with righteousness as the single most important thing. It must be a deep longing for right thinking, which helps us in our everyday life and, of course, with our own health. The sixth beatitude is, blessed are the merciful. And here we're reading, mercy is the complement to meekness, because those who are not merciful cannot be meek, nor peace-loving. It consists of the forgetting and forgiving of offenses. Hate and rancor denote a soul without elevation or greatness. Hate and anger also causes disease, as we know. The forgetting of offenses is in itself an ability of an evolved soul that floats above the blows that one may receive. Forgiveness is at the center of our work on this planet. Forgiveness is of utmost importance, and it's not the easiest. However, we must focus on forgiving other people's offenses and our own. All forgiveness starts with our own forgiveness. Number 6 is, blessed are the pure in heart. The purity of heart is inseparable from simplicity and humility. Again, humility. It completely excludes the idea of selfishness and pride. That is why Jesus presented childhood as an emblem of purity, in the same way that he used humility. True purity can exist only in angels. It is in the thought, since someone who has a pure heart will not even think bad thoughts. Everything just starts with our minds, with our thoughts and emotions, our feelings. And then we have the seventh beatitude is, blessed are the peacemakers. We touched on that as when we said, blessed are the meek and peace-loving. And then we have, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. And then lastly, we have, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. And there again, we need to follow the path of humility and to accept other people's offenses and forgive them. Because let us remember that Jesus, who was nailed on the cross in his last moments, forgave his offenders. And he said, God forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And perhaps we can remember that in moments where we feel so-called offended, that we too may attempt at least to forgive our offenders. Has Jesus performed miracles? And we said it before. The greatest miracle that Jesus performed was the revolution that his teachings of love and forgiveness caused in humans. Jesus was a revolutionary. He brought ideas, and let us think over 2,000 years ago, he was already bringing us those concepts that we're still struggling with today. That's how revolutionary his teachings of love and kindness were. His message is able to change us, making us become good beings, and thus we are transforming the world. This completes our expose on Jesus, which I know is rather superficial, considering the vastness and greatness of Jesus Christ and what he brought to this planet. But what we do know is if we go to the Sermon on the Mount and we study the Beatitudes, and not only study them but feel them, which means we're practicing them, bringing them into our own lives day in and day out, we will be on the path towards the good. We will be on the path of our own inner transformation, which is the single most important thing for us on this planet. Intellectually, we're quite advanced, but morally, we still have some catching up to do. And what can help us better than Jesus as our GPS? Maybe there's an app that would be called Jesus and his Beatitudes. Wouldn't that be a good idea? Well, this will be our last gathering for this year. Jesus completes our Louis Hu Spiritism 101. We will be back next year with a different subject matter, which we will be announcing on the Kardec Radio Facebook page. So stay tuned, please. And I thank you from the bottom of our hearts for attending these gatherings and listening and supporting us. I want to quickly see who was here and acknowledge our beautiful community. There's Hippolyto. Very nice to say. I'm saying hello. So nice that you're here. And Julija was here. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Julija. And then there's Gian Contino. Nice words. Best wishes from Brazil. How beautiful that you're listening all the way from Brazil. We're here from California. We're here in California, and I am part of the Bethesda Spiritual Healing Center and the founder of the Divine Light Spiritist Center in Northern California. Carol is listening. Beautiful Carol, thank you. And Melissa, nice to see you too. And Christina Mikami, hi from Invercargill. I don't know where that is. Can you tell us, Christina? And Teresa Castro, hi Teresa. And thank you so much for being here. And in closing, I would like to speak the Lord's Prayer, which was part of the Sermon on the Mount. So let us close our eyes, if we're not driving or doing anything or operating machinery, and feel our feet on the ground, and let us connect with Jesus, our guide and model. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. So be it. Many blessings. Goodbye.